Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Brown University School of Professional Studies special webinar, our Lessons in Leadership. Today we have Professor Ruben Fischer-Baum. I'll read his bio in a moment. There's Ruben. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the School of Professional Studies that's hosting this today. Our mission is to inspire and prepare graduate and professional learners to transform the way the world works for good. Our mission is to draw on Brown University's commitment to academic excellence, intellectual freedom, and diversity, equity, and inclusion to create and deliver programs that empower learners at all career stages to transform themselves, their workplaces, and the communities they serve. We offer in-demand master's programs, custom and non-credit degree programs. We have 33 professional early inquiry masters, 15 custom programs for organizations, and over 30 non-credit programs. Just a quick snapshot of what that looks like. There are three master's programs. The Master's in Health Leadership, it's a 24-month program. A 12-month program for those that are working in the healthcare industry and aspire to greater levels of leadership. We have the IE Brown Executive MBA. It's a partnership with the IE University based in Madrid, Spain. IE is their MBA is one of the highest ranked in Europe. It is a 15-month program with 5 residencies in South Africa, in Providence, and in Madrid. And then there's the Masters in Technology Leadership program. It's the program that I direct, 12-month program, also 12 months. We have 15 courses. Again, like the other two programs, it's targeted toward those with roughly at least 10 years experience that are striving for or have been asked to lead, to have greater influence in their organization. And Ruben, I'm very happy to say, is one of our faculty members in that program. Non-credit programs in the leadership space, leader as coach and effective communication. The faculty member who teaches effective communication, Barbara Tannenbaum, also teaches in my program, MTL, and she's one of Brown's most sought-after faculty. I think her undergraduate class has a 2-year waiting list. That's how profound the impact that she has on the lives of students. 2 courses in artificial intelligence, applied AI and data science, and human-centered AI, and a number of programs in mindfulness. And with that, let me introduce today's speaker. Oops, okay. Sorry, folks. Ruben Fischer-Baum is a journalist, designer, and developer. He is the senior data editor at Yahoo News, where he works on large-scale data products. He was previously a senior editor on the graphics team at the Washington Post and a visual journalist at 538 and Gawker Media. He has taught data visualization at Brown, RISD, several departments at Brown, by the way, Parsons School of Design, and given lectures and workshops at Harvard, Columbia, Tufts, NYU, Rice, Skidmore, Ithaca College, and Microsoft Research. He was a 21-22 fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard and a 2017-18 Paul Miller Fellow at the National Press Foundation. His work has been recognized by the Society for News Design, the Information is Beautiful Awards, and the Malafji Awards. He has received a BA in Environmental Studies with a concentration in urban planning from Yale. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ruben. But first, I want to just tell our audience that we absolutely welcome your questions, the conversation. Ruben's got 20 or so, 30 minutes of his material. Use the Q&A button. The chat button is disabled, and so we'll get to your questions after Ruben's presentation. So with that, I'm going to let Ruben take it away.
I probably could have given a warning about Malofieж, which is a Northern Spanish award ceremony, but I think you did great with it.
Thank
All
you.
right. Are people able to see this? Excellent. Hi, I'm Ruben. Today I'm going to be talking about visual storytelling, which is my area of expertise. I always like to start with a little bit of an explanation for how I got here, why I'm interested in this in the first place. So I, like maybe some of you, was obsessed with maps when I was a kid. I loved making maps in my yard. I loved any sort of children's book that had maps in it. This is from the Phantom Toll Booth. So when I was in college, I studied mapping. Specifically, I studied geographic information systems. I was big into math, and so I was learning software that would help me perform data analysis with spatial data. And in doing that, I started creating some of my first graphics. And at this point in my career, I guess you could say, I really liked the data work, but I didn't consider myself a designer in any way. I was just doing data analysis and just taking whatever the software spit out and then putting that in my reports. Then, in my first job out of school, I worked in urban planning for this nonprofit called the Times Square Alliance. And as young people often do, I felt like I had these great data skills. I was going to come, I was going to totally transform Times Square. And instead, I got to the job and they said, "Welcome, you are going to make all of the charts for our annual reports." And I was a little mad about this. I didn't think of myself as a designer. I thought of myself as a data analyst. But then I got these books that they handed to me from this data viz practitioner, Edward Tufte, and I started making these visualizations. And it just turned out that I really enjoyed that part of the job way more than I enjoyed some of the minutia of zoning that maybe was what I thought I was getting into. And so I did a little pivot, as I'm sure some of you have as well. I left urban planning and I wanted to seek a career where I could create lots of visualizations and iterate and do it for an audience. And so I ended up becoming a journalist. And in my early career, I got the opportunity to make lots and lots of graphics, many of them pretty bad, but that's how you learn. Started in sports journalism. I did a lot for the site Deadspin. Eventually, I shifted over to politics. I was at 538 for a long time. For many years, until pretty recently, I was a graphics editor at the Washington Post. And so I was leading a team of graphics reporters that were making graphics, including interactive graphics, which ends up being a big part of my career. And then more recently, I became a senior data editor at Yahoo News. So not all graphics all the time. A lot of it's more on the data side, but it's still fundamentally about how do we present data to a large audience. In addition to this work, I do teach, like Peter mentioned, I teach at MTL. I also teach Brown undergrads and graduate students as part of the data science program. And I also teach at RISD. I'm local to Providence. So today I'm going to be talking about why visual storytelling matters. And this talk is really tailored to the people who aren't necessarily making charts all the time. So all of you are probably encountering charts, encountering graphics, but you might not be the person who's in the trenches making those graphics. But I still think it's important to understand what the principles are behind making good graphics and how you can help make them happen. So why visual storytelling matters? A couple reasons. The first is that data analysis is only half the battle, by which I mean you can't, if you analyze the data, you come to some really interesting conclusion, just coming to that conclusion has gotten you nowhere. Because findings don't mean anything unless they actually lead to action. The whole point of doing the analysis is to try to convince some people that something is worth doing or not worth doing. That means that this inevitably involves humans communicating with other humans. Data visualization is not something that can just live in spreadsheets, that can just live in code. And humans are really different from each other. When you're working with data viz, you have to make really careful considerations of audience, because I'm sure that some of you are really into data, you love looking at really complicated charts, you absorb those well, and others of you, maybe not. Maybe you like something simpler. Maybe you don't want to see like the world's most complex visualization. In all humans, whether or not you have a high data tolerance, humans are turned off by bad charts. We've all seen bad charts in the wild that don't make sense or really confusing, and those we just shut down when we see those. And I'll talk a little bit about why during this presentation. Unfortunately, when we talk about bad charts, there are really two types of bad charts. So there are incorrect charts, like this one that appeared on Fox News quite a few years ago. And these are charts where they like literally made the chart wrong. Like this is a pie chart. Pie charts are supposed to add up to 100%. This pie chart does not add up to 100%. It adds up to much higher than that. And so this is an example of an incorrect chart. But then there are also charts that are totally correct. They are just poorly designed, like this one. And frankly, there are way more charts like this in the world, and these are a much harder problem to solve. It's easy to sort of follow a list of rules for how to make a correct chart. It's harder to follow a list of rules for how to make a well-designed chart. So what makes a well-designed chart? What we're actually going to be doing today is we're going to be walking through 5 core principles of effective visualization design. Then we're going to be extending, this is going to be, I will say point one will represent most of my talking, which probably will be longer than half an hour, but luckily the slides have lots of pictures in them, so bear with me. Then we're going to extend these principles to other types of information design, not just graphics. And we're going to wrap up by talking about how to give good design feedback following these principles. So once again, if you're not the person making the graphics, you might be encountering the person making the graphics, giving suggestions, maybe even giving suggestions to an AI agent about how to make something look better. Before we dive into that, I want to make one distinction between 2 types of graphics or 2 types of charts, exploratory and explanatory. So exploratory graphics, we've probably all made or seen. This is when you're just personally digging into a data set and you maybe have a dashboard, maybe you're in Excel, and you're just trying out lots of charts. You're just like using visualization to just explore the data. And it's not that the design of these charts don't matter, but they kind of don't matter. They're kind of just for you, or maybe they're for your very close colleague who understands the data set really well. And this is less the focus today. The focus today is explanatory charts, which is when you have moved past those initial visualizations to something that's actually going to be seen by more people. That could be totally outward facing. That could be charts used in marketing or in reports. It also could be inward facing. It could be charts used in a big presentation where you're kind of moving up the ladder to show it to other departments. Just any situation where you're preparing data visualization to be seen by people who are not working with the data every day. So with that out of the way, the 5 big principles that I always like to talk about that makes a well-designed chart are, is it accurate? Is it transparent? Is it decluttered? Is it focused? And then is it memorable? And we'll just go through these one by one. So is it accurate? You've maybe heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out, and that very much applies to data visualization. If you have bad data going into a graphic, it doesn't matter if you're the best designer in the entire world, you're going to produce a bad graphic. And there's a couple different parts to that. The first is that the underlying data itself needs to be accurate. This was on Reddit recently. I think this is totally made up, but it's sort of a fun hypothetical example of an AI making up some analytics data. The charts for that might be well designed, but they're no good if that analytics data is not good. The analysis itself, even if the underlying data is good, the analysis itself has to be accurate. Maybe some of you heard about this. This is a recent blow up in the econ world. There's a very famous 2010 paper about economic austerity, and it had to get redacted because they literally made an Excel mistake. They calculated an average without highlighting all of the rows. It was just a partial set of the rows. I think we've all done something similar, but it completely changed their finding. And then the encoding itself needs to be accurate. So encoding is a little bit of an insidery data viz term. That is what part of the visual actually is connected to the data. So for a bar chart, if the number is bigger, the bar gets longer. That is the encoding. You might have a circle where if the number gets bigger, the area of the circle gets bigger. That's an encoding. And the way you make incorrect charts is you get these encodings wrong. So these would be some bar charts that were created by OpenAI a few months ago. And bar charts have a rule, which is you have to start them at 0 or else you're giving these misleading numbers. And so we see on this that we have these 2 bars, 69.1, and one of them is labeled at 30.8, and they're the same height. That's wrong. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how data encodings work. And so this has led to an incorrect chart. And then finally, the labels themselves need to be accurate. This was a chart that I worked on at the Washington Post that we caught right before we published. This is a little bit old, but it was about Elon Musk's net worth. And all the underlying data was correct. And the chart itself is correct. Looks great. The encodings look great. But we had gotten a single letter wrong on this y-axis label. It should be a B. He's a billionaire, not a millionaire. And data visualization is really unforgiving. You get one letter wrong like that, and the entire chart is incorrect. It's not like you get partial credit. So that's accuracy. And then related to accuracy, its close cousin is transparency. So a well-designed visualization is going to do a couple things. It's going to tell me where and when the data is from. So this is a nice example from Bloomberg about really specifically telling me a source for some data and also how far back these records go. And then it's going to also provide any necessary caveats and methodologies that are really important for understanding it. So this is a more complex chart from Bloomberg. It's talking about small and mid-sized banks. And one of my first questions as a reader is like, okay, what counts as a small or mid-sized bank? How are those different than big banks? And this note at the bottom explains exactly what that means. I could talk a lot more about transparency, but this is a short webinar. So we're going to move on to decluttered, which is where we're really getting into the meat of design, graphic design land. So, clutter, what's wrong with clutter? Charts that are cluttered have too many elements, too many colors, too much going on, and this creates cognitive load. So I think this certainly happened to me. I suspect it's happened to all of you. You encounter a chart like this in the wild, and our brain just immediately ignores it. We say, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to keep reading some text. I'm going to look at something else. My attention span is short. I'm not going to engage with that. And so clutter creates this initial resistance. It's not like you're going to dig into this graphic and have trouble understanding it. It's that on first glance, you're going to say, no, I am not doing that. So how do we deal with clutter? How do we avoid it? This was a big point of that data viz practitioner I mentioned, Edward Tufte. He was the person whose books I received at my first job. And he was obsessed with this idea of data to ink ratio. The idea that your charts should have as much of the data as possible and as little as anything else. You want to remove, remove, remove until you're just left with the data. And so you end up with these really hyper minimalist visualizations like this one on the right, where as like the grid lines are gone, there's no background, the box plot has been reduced as much as possible. And these are really interesting and they're really given the context of the time where people were producing lots and lots of bad charts, this is a really important step. I think that this is maybe a little bit too minimalist, and you don't quite have to go to this same degree. So my little steps for decluttering, how to declutter, are I remove, but then I mostly minimalize, and I align, and I let breathe. So remove means you want to remove all the stuff that you don't need at all. So here's an example of a really classic like 90s bad Excel chart on the left, and then a cleaned up version on the right. There was a lot from this chart that it didn't need at all. You didn't need that textured background. You didn't need this thick black border around the chart area. You didn't need the drop shadow and that 3D effect on the bars itself. And if you just remove and remove and remove those things, you end up with a chart like what you get on the right, which is a lot cleaner. So that's deletion. Every single pixel counts when it comes to removal. So this is a big point that all that matters for all graphic design, including visualization design. Um, every single pixel counts. Good design is the sum of many small choices. So this is from an exercise I do with some students in class where they have to design a chart and you might have a y-axis like this, which lists out numbers up to 3 million with lots of zeros. You can remove a bunch by just spelling out million on the first row and dropping all those zeros. And you can remove even more by shortening that million to an M and just using as few pixels as possible to convey the same point. So that's removal. But what ends up being a lot more important than removal is minimization. So how can we take things that we need, but make them less visually prominent, have them sort of fade into the background? So this is a really nice New York Times chart that I often teach off of that has a lot going on. There's two charts next to each other. That's called small multiples. There's a lot of different labeling. There's a bunch of lines. And they don't want to get rid of these grid lines in the background, but they do want to make them less prominent than these other lines. And so they made them really light gray. They made them really thin, and they made them dotted. And so that would be a nice example of making something recede to the background. Similar with these y-axis labels over on the left, they're not black, they're gray. They're important, they need to be there, but they're not the first thing you want to look at. On the point of minimization, color is a really big part of that. One of the easiest ways for a graphic to get cluttered is to just have way too many colors. So this version on the left, not ideal. Obviously, if you can't, you often can't make everything the same color, but there's a lot of solutions where you use fewer hues, hues being like red versus purple versus orange to still distinguish color without having it look quite so crazy. I could give a whole lecture about color, and I do. Color is really fascinating. So then after you minimize, you want to do some alignment. So this will be another example of a chart, this one from the Wall Street Journal, that has a lot going on. There's a lot of different text on top of this graphic. These annotations really help guide you. It'd be really easy for them to feel cluttered and too busy, but they're all nicely lined up. There is some nice left alignment, there is some nice alignment on the top, and that's sort of drawing everything together in a nice organized way. One of my bosses, the head of the graphics team at the Washington Post, came from National Geographic. He used to design those big, huge, like fold out National Geographic graphics, which are crazy busy and complicated. And the secret to them is that everything is lined up with something. Nothing is just off on its own in like its own space. A couple other things that are important for alignment. One is meaningfully sort your data. This is like a really easy low-hanging fruit one, but you still see it done incorrectly a lot. We expect charts to be sorted in some way that makes sense, and it just looks a lot more organized if they're sorted. And one little sticking point I have is I find alignment to get really complicated once you start having vertical text or 45-degree text. This is a pretty common thing that you run into with some Excel defaults. I think Tableau does it as well. And there are other ways around this, like flipping the whole chart 90 degrees. Whenever possible, try to avoid it. Final element of decluttering is to let your elements breathe. This is not just a data viz thing. This is just a classic graphic design thing. Here is a little bit fuzzy, but a menu for a restaurant that is very tight, everything packed together. You keep the exact same menu, you just literally expand it, add some white space between things. Suddenly it's a lot less cluttered, a lot more legible. This New York Times graphic, which is quite complicated, has some nice stuff going on with it. There is some nice white space up top to make sure that the headline is separated from the chart area. There's plenty of white space on the bottom to make sure that the note and the source line are not like right up against the bottom of the x-axis. And there's some nice white padding around these two sort of secondary labels to make sure they're not overlapping with the line. So that's some design decluttering. But the truth is, sometimes unpopular among data analysts, but the most important decluttering step actually happens before you're making a chart at all. It happens in choices that occur during analysis. And this doesn't mean like delete a bunch of data because it's cluttering things up, but it does mean make smart choices about grouping stuff together. So you might have, for example, let's say I was interested in what sort of languages are spoken in Providence County. I could go pull some census data. I could try to make a pie chart of this, but the truth is that there are dozens of languages spoken in Providence County, most of them spoken by very few people, and it's just way too much stuff to pack into one chart. And so if I instead group those categories and make a bunch of those small slices into this other category, I start to have something more interesting. I start to learn that actually a pretty serious slice of Providence County speaks Portuguese or Portuguese Creole. That is a notable thing about this region. So that's an example of data decluttering. And then another way you can clutter your data is through improper data granularity. So if I wanted to know, is Providence getting warmer over time? I can go to the National Weather Service. I can download a data set that has temperature records for every single day back to 1948 at the airport. And if I just put that on a chart, it looks terrible because it's showing that I have all these crazy spikes, which are showing that every single year Providence gets hot in the summer and cold in the winter. That's boring. I know that already. And so this is too granular. But instead, if I aggregate those days into years, I start to get something that shows a little bit more of an interesting trend. And then maybe I want to add a best fit and do some data smoothing. This is an additional decluttering step. Without having touched the design of the chart at all, just changing the analysis, I've made something that makes a lot more sense. So that is decluttering. Next up, a good chart, a well-designed chart should be focused. Focused meaning, does the chart use text and visual cues to emphasize key findings? Another way of putting this, is your chart telling a story? This is going to be a little bit of a tone shift here. I have a set of charts that I want to show that I think are really instructive, but they're really depressing. So this is the first one. It is age 0 to 18 pedestrian fatalities by date, going back to 1982. So this is, to put it in more plain English, the day of year when most children are killed by cars. And if you look closely at this graphic, you probably can figure out what's going on, which is that there's a big spike. There's a couple of big spikes, but there's one really big spike. And it seems to happen towards the end of October or the beginning of November. A little hard to tell, but it is in fact happening at the end of October because it's Halloween. For somewhat understandable reasons, Halloween is a night that has a lot of children on the street after dark. There ends up being fatalities. That's by far the most important finding in this data. There's also a little bit of a finding about July 4th, which is another spike, but I don't think this chart is doing a really good job of focusing me towards that. I can figure out what day that is, but that's not the same thing as telling a story that guides me to it. So here's another version of the chart that I think is doing a little bit better. It still has this really generic headline, child pedestrian fatalities by day of year, but we've actually added this annotation on Halloween to focus my attention towards that. And then I am coming from a journalism background. So here's a version of the chart that is, I think, even more focused. And this was produced by Vox. And so now we have a much more specific headline. Halloween is the deadliest day of the year for child pedestrians. We have a subhead that just does the busy work of explaining what the data set is. And then we also have October 31st annotated. And so now there are three different visual signals that are drawing my attention to Halloween. The headline says it, the annotation says it, and the shape of the data itself says it. Like that spike is very prominent. That might seem like overkill. I will say that one lesson from working in journalism is that it's really hard to overdo focusing readers towards your finding. If you think your finding is important, say it over and over and over again, really drill it home. And part of that is that words are your most powerful tool. So I was a graphics editor at the Washington Post for 8 years. And in that, I was giving a lot of graphic design feedback, but I was also editing a lot of text. Text is just so crucial to storytelling and to good data visualization. The sort of classic journalism setup that I often encourage people to do in their data storytelling is that the headline should state the takeaway. What's the most important thing that someone should come away with? And then the subhead does that busy work of explaining what the data set is. This is a really nice example from the Financial Times. Annotations can also be a really important tool here. Additional text on the chart area itself, which is laying out other bits of key context. So focusing isn't all about text. There is some graphic design elements of it as well, and that is what I would call visual hierarchy. So in this New York Times graphic, I think I'm not going to sort of call on people to say, but I think it's fair to say that we are drawn to looking at the United States first before we look at other countries. And why do we do that? What visual cues are making us look at the United States first? And I count four things here. So the United States is colored when the others are not. The United States has a thicker line when the others do not. The United States, its text is bolded when the others are not. And then the most subtle one, easy to miss, my class is often stumped by it, is that US line is literally on top of the other lines. The stack order has been changed, so all of the lines go behind that one, that goes on top, and in fact, it even goes on top of the x-axis itself, which is one of those subtle little changes that's making this chart feel very polished, and the sort of thing that chart software is not going to do by default. So just to emphasize those again, you can use visual hierarchy through color. This bar is tall, but it's also darker. Visual hierarchy through ordering, putting something on top of other things is very powerful. Size and weight, having this line being a little bit thicker and colored and use bold text makes it really prominent. And the reason that this works is because the way that our brain is going to process visuals is we're always looking for the pattern breaker. If you have a bunch of different dots or a bunch of different lines, we are looking for the one that is different, either because it's wider, because it's bigger, because it's a different shape. So that was a lot of talking. One thing I like to do is just go through a full example of a chart that I think is pretty bad and then making it good by following these kind of decluttering and focusing steps. Just checking that we're good on time. Good. So here's a chart that I made. I'm not going to pick on someone else's example. It's a little bit old. It was made using this charting software ggplot, which is part of the R language, and it's bad. This is a chart that's trying to show that Boston is getting warmer over time. Specifically, I'm looking at daily low temperatures. Like I'm interested in nights getting warmer, because that ends up being a more important metric for climate change than are the days getting warmer. And so I have data going back to 1936 through 2022, and I'm just tossing all of that onto a chart, throwing some best fits on it, and I'm making this distinction between data from the last decade, which was in green, and then all the data before that, which is red. And I think it's fair to say that this chart is a failure. No one could look at this and interpret anything from it. So let's make some changes. First, I'm going to do my first decluttering step. I'm going to delete some stuff I really don't need. The ggplot defaults have some stuff I don't like. It has tick marks. It has this big gray background. It has way too many axis lines. I get rid of them. Then I want to highlight the most important elements. I want to do some focusing to bring it forward. In this case, the trend lines are actually more important for understanding the graphic than the individual points themselves. I like keeping the individual points because it kind of shows that climate is variable and things change from year to year. But the trend line are really like where the finding lives. So I'm going to make a change where I'm going to make all those dots way lighter and make the trend line itself a bit bolder. And that looks like that. I think this chart is still not in great shape, but we are slowly and surely getting somewhere. Next, I want to use fewer colors. So by default, I've made two categories in my data. In my coding software, my charting software has made one of them green and one of them red because it thinks they're equally important. I haven't told it otherwise. But often, it's a good move to use as few colors as possible in your visualization. And so in this case, I really want to focus readers' attention on the most recent decade and then use all the previous data as kind of this background information to compare against. So instead of doing two different hues, a turquoise and a red, I'm going to make the past decade red, and I'm going to make everything else gray. And I'm going to change both my lines and my dots. And so now we can start to see a little bit of a difference in the trend lines more clearly. Next, I want to do a little bit of white space decluttering. So I want to be intentional about white space. A couple issues happening here. I don't think there's enough white space on top of this chart. And I actually think there's too much white space on the side of this chart. There's kind of these extra gutters that I don't think are necessary. So I grow the top and I shrink the sides, and I have a little bit of a better setup there. Then one sort of controversial thing is that I think that whenever possible, I like to use direct labels instead of keys. When you're using a key, you're asking a reader to look at the data, then look somewhere else to understand it, then look back at the data, then look somewhere else to understand it. I prefer to get my labels on top of the data itself. This is not always possible. I produce tons of graphics that have keys, but when you can make a change, it can be really helpful. So I get rid of that key and I add some direct labels for the past decade and for previous. And now I'm going to do a bunch of work with my text. I think my text could be doing a much better job my text and annotation could be doing a much better job of sort of telling the story here. So right now I'm just saying that Boston is getting warmer, but that's not actually true. These two trend lines are really close to each other for most of the year, except from July through mid-October. So that period of time is actually where my finding lives. And on top of that, there's a couple other issues. My headline is not specific enough. I'm repeating the word Boston in my subhead. My y-axis, which is temperature, doesn't have any units on it. I think it's a pretty fair assumption that I mean Fahrenheit, but it's better to just specifically say it. So I'm going to make a couple changes. And I'm also going to make a slightly bigger change, which is right now I'm just using the default font that my charting software is using. I'm actually going to change it to a different font, which is just a sans serif I like that we used at the Washington Post. Oh, sorry. I'm going to do that next. First, I'm just going to change the actual text. So I wanted to draw people's attention to July through October. I have done that by adding that yellow highlight to that area. And I've added a direct annotation that specifically says what happened during that period of time, which is in the past decade, daily lows have been 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in July through October. I also now have a more specific headline. I'm talking about summer and fall, and I'm emphasizing that I'm talking about night temperatures, not day temperatures. I have removed Boston from my subhead. Every pixel counts, clean up your text when you can, and I've added Fahrenheit to my y-axis. Now I want to be intentional about the actual text hierarchy here, and there's just a couple steps left in this process. So text hierarchy is this idea that I want it to be clear what text you're supposed to look at first, then what you're supposed to look at next, and then what you're supposed to look at next. And right now, there's a couple issues. I feel like these direct labels, which are bold and dark, are more prominent than my headline. I want people to look at the headline first. And then this annotation in the past decade, that feels more important to me than the X and Y axis and source labels. And so I want, but they're all the same color gray right now. So I want to bring that forward. So I'm going to make some changes there. And this is also where I'm going to change the font. So you'll notice that. Now my headline is bold and past decade annotation is a full black, not a gray. My X and Y axis labels are a lighter gray. Coming up on my last change, I want to improve the alignment of my graphic. So there's a couple alignment issues happening right now. My headline and my y-axis have slightly different alignments. My two direct labels aren't lined up with each other. The source line in the bottom right is floating off by itself. I'm just going to move it to the left to line up with everything else. And then a really subtle thing that just bothers me personally is the month labels are all lined up at the beginning of the month. So this is a little subtle, but like the March label is actually straddling February and March. I'm just going to slide all those labels over so they actually line up with the middle of the month they represent. And it's kind of fun to just pop back and forth between these two slides. This is the aligned version. This is the unaligned version. Many small changes. And this is where we've gotten. So on the left is my original graphic. On the right is my cleaned up graphic. It's still a pretty complicated graphic. There might be a bunch of other stuff that I might want to change about it, but I think we can agree that it has been much improved from the version on the left. And that involves some big changes, like changing the font and changing the colors and changing the key. But it also involved lots of little changes around things like alignment and white space. So that's my example. Now, just to very briefly talk about the fifth quality of a well-designed graphic, I think that a well-designed graphic, when possible, should be not just accurate, transparent, decluttered, and focused, it should also be memorable. So here is an example of a monster graphic. This is by this guy, Nigel Holmes. He made a lot of graphics for places like USA Today and Time Magazine. And I think it would be fair to call him Edward Tufte's nemesis. They were contemporaries. They legitimately did not seem to like each other. And Tufte would often use his examples in his books to be like, here's an example of something that is super clustered, super cluttered, that needs to be cleaned up, that has too much chart junk going on. However, there was this really interesting study that happened a couple of years ago called Useful Junk, the Effects of Visual Embellishment on Comprehension and Memorability of Charts. And this is an experiment where they took these Nigel Holmes charts and then they created the most minimalist version of the same data that they could. And so these are the same chart, just embellished and not. And then they showed these to a bunch of readers, and there was two things they were checking. The first is which chart is easier to understand? And then the second is they checked in 2 weeks later and asked respondents, were they able to remember the takeaway that the chart showed? And this ended up with a really interesting finding, which is that people were able to understand the version on the right better, but just a little bit. And they remembered the finding from the version on the left better 2 weeks later. And this, I think, gets at an interesting tension in data visualization, which is we're often focusing on initial reactions. Are people able to read this? Are they going to go away from it? But the point of making charts and the point of working with data is not to like have a 2-second reaction. It's to actually have a result that sticks with people that they remember. And so this sort of complicates some of the design recommendations that someone like Tufte was making. So am I saying that your company's charts should look like Nigel Holmes' graphics? I am absolutely not saying that. Nigel Holmes really went super hard on making his graphics look crazy, and he was also a great illustrator, so he was able to pull it off. Luckily, there are much smaller interventions that you can make to make your graphics more memorable. The most important of which is avoiding defaults. So every chart software, anything you use internally, Excel, ggplot, D3, Tableau, Data Wrapper, they all have default colors and default fonts. And if you use the default colors and default fonts, your chart is going to look the same as 1 million other charts that already exist in the world, and that's going to make it less memorable. When appropriate, and it's not always appropriate, you can employ visual flourishes to make the little kind of special touches that make a chart feel a little bit different. This is a really hardcore astrophysics chart that appeared in Science Magazine. I will say that some of it is a beyond me, but it's showing a bunch of planets outside of their solar system and are they similar to planets in our solar system? And it has this delightful detail, which is the planets in our solar system are actually represented by little images of the planets themselves, which has always made me remember this graphic when I'm sure I would forget 99% of astrophysics graphics. Sometimes this is a lot more straightforward. This is a really fun example from Bloomberg about how much billionaires are worth, and it just tossed some images of the billionaires in there into this little stacked bar chart. You also can do this with things like texture. Here's a nice example of a sort of coffee texture from the Washington Post and this nice tennis wear texture from Reuters. And even just using white space in interesting ways can make for a more memorable graphic. So one thing I really liked about the New York Times graphic I showed earlier was the way China actually breaks up into the chart area and creates this really interesting and unique effect that makes it different than most charts that exist. One of the most direct routes to producing memorable graphics is to use thematic colors. Thematic colors meaning colors that are actually related to the subject matter. So this is another example from the world of scientific communication. This was Science Magazine. The lead paper was this study about how plants defend themselves from bugs. Whoever edits the cover of Science Magazine was like, easiest work week of my life. Plants, a lot of them are green. Bugs, a lot of them are green. We have these great photos of plants eating bugs. They look awesome. Ship it. I'm done. And then you actually open up Science Magazine and go to the study, and they use ggplot default colors. And so this is the sort of thing that breaks my heart. Sometimes data viz is hard, or sometimes design is hard, but sometimes it's as easy as if your data involves a bunch of green stuff, maybe use some green in your charts. Or if your data is about cherry blossoms, maybe use some pink in your charts. Makes it more unique. The last thing I'll say when it comes to making memorable charts that involves humans communicating with other humans is you should never be afraid to add a human touch. So we think of graphics as being very computery and rigid and precise, and they are all those things, but having an annotation layer on top of it that feels like a human trying to convey something to another human, like using these sort of hand-drawn annotations that I've used in the past, can make something feel a little more approachable, a little different, especially if you're trying to show it to someone who's not used to looking at lots and lots of charts. There's a woman I used to work with, Mona Chalabi, who now has a whole data visualization practice. And she does this all the time. She fully converts her graphics to have this sort of hand-drawn effects. These graphics are as precise as any graphic that I would produce with code. She is producing them with code and then sort of drawing on top of them. But she has had tremendous success doing something that's really hard, which is getting people who don't normally care about data to look at and engage with graphics, which is a challenge that many of you are probably on both sides of. So those are the 5 big design principles I wanted to talk through: accurate, transparent, decluttered, focused, memorable. In my last couple of minutes of talking, I just want to expand this and offer some good news, which is I hope if you have signed up for this webinar, you like graphics, you like visualization, but these same principles also apply to all aspects of information design. So information design would be the broader category of work that data visualization is under. And so you can apply these same principles to charts as you can to tables. That might seem like an obvious example, but they also apply to presentations. You'll find lots of great advice around presentations that involves decluttering, minimizing, focusing, the idea that every single slide should have one point on it. These are very much the same high-level principles that can turn a bad chart into a good chart. They apply to user interfaces as well. If you're looking at some of the recommendations that Apple makes when you're designing in its App Store, they are using the exact same visual hierarchy principles that we use to clean up our own chart. They apply to making websites, the same principle of where do you want someone to look first, where do you want to look second, making sure you have plenty white space, not feeling too crowded, making sure that things are aligned. all of these types of work material rely on these sort of fundamental high-level graphic design principles. The last little thing I want to talk about, again, acknowledging that some of you will probably be in the trenches making charts yourselves. I hope you are. Making charts is really fun, but some of you won't. Some of you are going to be encountering charts, trying to improve them internally, trying to improve them for your company's communication. And here is some advice from my years being on the other side of this about how to give useful feedback in this area. So one is that I always encourage you to present problems, not solutions. So instead of coming in with a graphic and being like, I would recommend trying to change this and this and this and this and this, identify in a broader sense what things are not working for you. Like I find this is true for me. I find this part of Edward Tufte's Richter scale chart to be really confusing. And then bringing that to the chart maker or the team or the data analysis team and saying, okay, you guys are the professionals. We can help figure out some solutions to this, but this is the area where I'm having the most problem. You should also bring your domain knowledge to these conversations. So I made this set of graphics as sort of for presentation purposes many years ago. And then I presented them in a computer science conference, and a computer scientist came up to me afterwards and said, great presentation, I loved it, but your chart's wrong. Because when I was calculating my best fit lines, it was pretending that these data points over here are completely disconnected from those data points over there. But that's not true because actually December 31st is right next to January 31st because the year makes a circle instead of just being like a start point and an end point. And so there actually was a different way I should have calculated my best fit line to account for that. And so bringing your own knowledge that you have about the data and how it works is really important for making sure that the charts are as accurate as possible. Similar to domain knowledge, bringing your audience knowledge. So you might understand better than the chart maker who the chart is actually for. Is it for executive level at the internally? Is it for marketing materials? If it's for marketing materials, who's being targeted? So this would be an example of the astrophysics chart. Among astrophysicists, they probably know what all the planets are in that solar system without having to like just by looking at them. I'm not an astrophysicist. I could use some labels on those to help me recognize which is which. Certainly Saturn I have down, but some of the other ones I could use a hand with. And then you guys are probably in positions where you are getting to think really high level about the storytelling. And so if you are seeing a graphic like this, it's always super helpful feedback to say, okay, what story are we trying to tell here? How can we better guide people towards understanding that Halloween is a place that is a time that has really high fatalities? How can we focus that? How can we guide people towards that? And I would encourage you to react at multiple speeds when you're trying to give feedback on a graphic. So first impressions are really, really important. That idea of cognitive load is real, and it's really easy for charts to just get totally skipped and ignored. So give feedback that will help avoid that happening, but also spend some time with trying to understand the chart more deeply than that and giving thoughts that you think could help guide the storytelling beyond just, this looks crazy, I don't want to deal with it. And it helps to, like I said, small things matter, small things add up. So help the chart maker interrogate every single pixel. Consider every aspect of it and think about, could this be removed? Could this be deleted? Be their partner in considering every aspect of the graphic. That is what I have. I think we have a Q&A open, so I'll look for questions there. That certainly was a little longer than half an hour, but I think we still have plenty of time for Q&A.
We do. We do.
Stop
We got a
sharing.
bunch of questions, Ruben. And remind the audience that please use the Q&A button to put your questions in there. I have a quick sort of question for you. But before I joined Brown, I worked for almost 10 years for a very big engineering company, huge, General Dynamics. And I used to underline suffer through so many engineering presentations. And I would ask every young engineer every time, I'd say, what is the purpose of your presentation, of any presentation? And you could imagine they would all say, it's to convey information. And I would correct them and say, no, it's to persuade, right? You're presenting calculations, you're presenting an engineering solution. You want our customer to believe in that, to buy that, right? It kind of blew their mind. So I guess my question to you is when you work with people that have that sort of mindset, right? Is this, I just need to present the quantitative data and tell my audience. How do you help them sort of pivot to ultimately what your entire course is about, which is telling a compelling story?
Hmm.
Like any story, it has a narrative arc, it has a point of view, and you have an audience in mind. So, and I guess I mean this question from two perspectives. One is as the chart maker, but also as a chart interpreter or a story interpreter. We are bombarded. We live in a mediated world. So how do we, as consumers of that, be critical of the things that we're looking at, knowing that there is somebody trying to persuade us of a point of view? So I don't know. That's a big question. And then we'll get to the question from the audiences.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things about that. First of all, yes, this is absolutely really common. In my work at Brown, you work with a lot of engineers, I interact with a lot of scientists, and this is sort of a classic science communication blunder of they're like, oh, well, the point, they might not even say the purpose is to convey information. They might say the purpose of the charts is transparency. It's to show that there was all this data and that this work actually happened and it's not made up. And I think that they have learned that you have to convey to them that that gets you nowhere. This comes up all the time in public health communication. Like, I think people understand when it comes to public health that it's not just a case of like presenting 8 gajillion data points to a general audience, and then they'll be like, "Oh, totally, I get it now." It's about telling a story. It's about emphasizing the most important things. From the perspective of helping people edit their charts and start to like move in the right direction, I really like to spend a lot of time with headlines. I think that's the first and most, and that's true for slide decks too. That's the first and most important moment where you're forcing someone to say, don't just tell me what this data is, tell me what your finding is. And then the process of sort of iterating on that and getting closer and closer to a more specific finding, I think helps people understand why that's so powerful and important before they even start making other edits on the chart themselves that move in that direction.
Oh, thank that. Appreciate that. So here's a couple questions from our audience. What are your thoughts on heat maps? That's something I certainly encountered by the thousands in the engineering world. So what are your thoughts on those?
So heat maps, okay, I have a couple thoughts on heat maps. I love it when people ask about specific chart types. I would say I'm largely enjoy a good heat map. In my time at 538, I made lots of prediction dashboards for both sports models and political models that were really heavy on heat maps. The challenge with heat maps is that one, there's a couple challenges. One, people can often use them as an excuse to pack in way more data than is necessary. And two, this is getting a little bit into some stuff I cover in my class. Color is actually not a super great data encoding for telling the difference between two numbers. Like if you have a bar in a bar chart, it's really easy to tell which bar is longer. And it's even pretty easy to tell how much longer the bar is. Like a bar that's twice as long is pretty clear than another bar. Our brain does not do that well with color. We can sort of tell which color is darker or more saturated. We're good at that. But being able to tell like, oh, that color is twice as saturated as another color, that our brain really cannot handle. And that's why heat maps usually put the data labels on top of every single square. Because if you don't do that, it's really hard to interpret the numbers. So I would say if you're in a time where data density is appropriate, you want to get a lot of numbers in there, heat maps can be really interesting. They can be really beautiful, but at least explore alternate chart forms that make use of encodings like bars and lines, more standard things, before you fully commit to heat maps.
Thank you. Not a question, but a sentiment that all of us at Brown certainly agree with wholeheartedly. Please let the presenter know he is awesome.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking of color, how do you deal with color when considering a colorblind audience?
Great question. So when color has a couple different accessibility concerns. So there is a pretty sizable portion of the population that have various types of color blindness. One thing that we always avoid is the classic red to green color gradient. That is the difference between those colors will not be detectable by some portion of your readership. Also, even if it could, it looks really Christmassy and I don't like it anyways. So there's some really great tools online for if you're using color gradients to test how they might look to someone who has various types of color blindness so you can avoid them. And many of the color palettes I use in my day-to-day work are from places like this is a site Color Brewer 2 that has a set of predefined palettes that are already passing these accessibility checks. One thing I will say is color blindness is one accessibility concern. Maybe an even bigger concern in that it affects more people is contrast. So you could have a chart that follows all color blindness things, but then has really light gray text that is really hard to read if you're older, if it's dark, if you have a lot of if you have eyeglasses. And so paying both attention to make sure you have sufficient contrast and that you're using colorblind safe colors is the path to making a color accessible chart.
Just a quick question. Please remind us of the designer who made the monster graph, that's their Tufty nemesis,
That is Nigel Holmes.
Nigel Holmes. All right. Any guidance for using visual design to get through to an especially skeptical audience?
So it depends. It certainly depends on why they're skeptical. Um, so it's a tough question to answer without the full context. I would say that if your graphics are really unpolished, they're really easy to dismiss. And so figuring out what, like, sometimes when people are skeptical, it's because you're doing a bad job of trying to persuade. You're throwing too much at them. You actually think you have one point you're trying to make, but you're actually making 20 points. And so doing the process of that focusing to try to distill what is the most important aspect that I'm trying to convey, that at least will help you understand like where there's a gap between you and them. And also if you have one really important thing you're trying to convince them of, you can approach it in different ways. So having sort of a text-based approach in a chart that highlights one aspect of the data, and maybe a chart that shows more data if they feel like maybe you're being misleading with it. Trying different avenues will work for different people, depending on why they're skeptical.
This is my editorial. I don't know if this is true. I had heard long ago that PowerPoint presentations should have no, like 3 points. It should never be an even number for some reason. I don't know why, just something about the way the memory works. But um, sometimes we have to present very complex arguments or complex pieces of information, and we need a complex presentation.
Mhm.
So in the face of that, though, you're still telling a story, you're still persuading. It's presumed often that you want your audience to react. You want them to do something as a result of this. Maybe that famous Tufty article about the space shuttle disaster, it was buried in a footnote. So here's a question. How do you balance how complicated a visual is based on the intended audience?
So that's a great question. So you will be the person who best knows your audience's appetite for both data and for different chart forms. So for example, there's a bunch of types of statistical chart forms. Chart form is like my annoying designer term for like types of charts. Like something like a box plot or a box and whisker or a violin plot. You maybe never even heard of those, and that's because I would never show those to a general audience. But if the audience is really statistically minded, maybe I'd be comfortable showing them that. And so when it comes to balancing that complexity, you have to know what your audience is aware of. But another way to minimize complexity is to not try to do everything with one chart. It's the exact same principle about slides in a presentation. Don't try to pack all your points into one slide. If you have complex data, you can split that into multiple graphics instead of trying to have one graphic that makes three or four different points to it. So when in doubt, try seeing what would it mean like to do a couple charts instead of one chart.
And I think we have time for just one last question. Any special design considerations for interactive charts, such as Tableau or Power BI,
Power BI.
Power BI? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I could give a whole different talk about what changes when it comes to interactivity. Interactivity on its own is adding an entire layer of complexity. And so there's a lot of things I can say. I will say one lesson from my time making a lot of interactive charts for journalism, which is if there is something really important you want people to know, do not hide it behind an interaction. So if you think it's like if you have a scatter plot and there's some really interesting context about each point, but the only way you can see it is if you mouse over the point to see it, even a technical audience, you should know the vast majority of them are not going to interact with it in any way. The most important thing is always like the default view, the first view, Then things like filters, like drop downs, those get those can be like depending on your user interface, those can go quite well in guiding people towards using those. But the idea that every single person is like really going to go deep and explore your data ends up just not being realistic. So really pay attention to what the like high level understanding or point you're trying to make is.
Thank you so much, Ruben. It's inspirational talk. And it's so practical. I want to take every PowerPoint I've ever made and just burn it in effigy right at this very moment, because I know they could all be so much better as a result of this. Thank you very much, Ruben, for your time today, for your expertise, and thank you, our audience, for your very thoughtful questions and for joining us. And please join us again for one of many of Brown's SPS webinars. Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much
Take
for having
care.
me.
Bye
Bye.
bye.